of the lecture, we're going to discuss a couple of other important things when it comes to the macroeconomy. More specifically, we're going to talk about inflation and unemployment. So you probably already heard inflation when you watch TV or when you talk to somebody else, and you probably have a general idea of what inflation is. You know, when inflation is happening, prices are increasing. So when we define inflation, we say that it's an increase in the overall price level. So it's important to think that inflation is happening when prices in United States overall for all the goods and services increase. Not necessarily for every single one of the goods that we have or every single one services, but it has to be more than for just one or couple of things. So when gasoline prices increase, even though some people would like to call that inflation, it's not. So when we say inflation, we mean overall increase in price level, meaning that for most of the goods and services, prices increase. So how do we measure inflation? It's the percentage change in the price level. So if you look at the formula, we're using this general percentage formula where we take something new minus old over old. So price level in a particular year, we call it year 2, minus price level in a year before or year 1, and divided by the price level of year 1. So for example, if we measure in the inflation in 2009, this price level year 2 is going to be prices in the beginning of 2010 minus price level in the beginning of 2009 divided by the beginning of the 2009 multiplied by 100%. So end of the period minus beginning of the period divided by the beginning of the period. So what is it? What do we mean by the price level? Well, this price level is measured by Consumer Price Index. It measures the changes in overall cost of the goods and services that a typical household buys. And this price level or Consumer Price Index is compiled monthly by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So let's go visit their website and see what this Consumer Price Index looks like. So this is a table from Bureau of Labor Statistics website. You can see bls.gov. Okay, so you can probably just search for the Consumer Price Index on Google and BLS, and it will probably provide you with this table right away. So we see that this table gives us the Consumer Price Index starting from 1913 up until 2013. So what do all those numbers mean? So this, let's say for 2013, 232 is the percentage change in price level from 1980. Why is actually 1983? Why is 1983? I believe something was going on in 1983. Maybe the Consumer Price Index was revised, but you can see that in 1983 we get this 100% equivalent to our Consumer Price Index. And if you start reading the literature, economic literature on inflation and GDP, where we're trying to use a certain base year, so prices in a particular year, we fix them and we measure all of our activity based on those prices. A lot of times you would see that it's based on 1983 prices. So economists just decided to have that year as a base year. So everything else, all the prices are measured in relationship to that particular year. So we assume that the prices were at 100% level, right? So let's say next year prices increased by 2%, and that's what's going to be reflected in our Consumer Price Index. Let's say we started from 100%, a year later we had 104%. So prices really increased by 4.5% from July of 1983 to July of 1984. If you look further, let's say July 2010, compared to 1983, prices increased by 118%. So prices more than doubled in those 27 years. If you look at 2013, right, and compare it to 1983, so the price level was at 100%. Now it is at 233%. So what it means is that prices increased by 133%. And since 1983 is our base year, if you look backwards at the prices before 1983, price level before this year, you will see that all the numbers are less than 100%. Once again, this just because we take 1983 as our base year. So everything else would be less than 100% because price level was much lower, right? So when you hear your grandma comparing the house value in 1960s, of course it was much less, and that was not so much due to the value of the house, but a lot was attributed to the price level during that year. So let's see how we actually can calculate. Let's look at the examples of how we can calculate inflation level based on this consumer price index, or as we said in other words, we call it a price level. So just to remind you that inflation equals to price level in a particular year minus price level in a year before divided by price level in a year before. Or we can measure it as consumer price index in the year 2 minus consumer price index in the year 1 divided by consumer price index in the year 1. So let's look at the example. Let's calculate the inflation rate for January 2013. So what we need is we need the consumer price index for January 2013 and consumer price index for February 2013. So the consumer price index is going to be calculated in the beginning of the months, right? So we're trying to capture by how much overall prices changed from one month to another. So if we look at our CPI table that we just looked at right now, we're looking at January 2013, right? It was 230.28, and in February it was 232.16. So that's the numbers we're going to use to calculate our inflation. So in January 2013, the CPI is equals to 230. In February 2013, it equals to 232. So we can't just simply subtract it. The price level did not increase by 2%. It simply we show that the price level is 230, so don't even have to think about that percentage. It simply says that from 1980 the prices increased by 130%, and into February it increased by 132%. But once again, we measure inflation relative to the previous time period, or whatever time period we're going to assume we're going to measure it against. So we need to use this formula, new minus old over old. So our new inflation level, which is February 2013, minus the January 2013 divided by January 2013 inflation multiplied by 100%, we'll see that inflation equals to 0.8%. So during the months of January 2013, prices increased by 0.8 percentage points, so less than 1%, which is quite a bit, but still it's nothing to be very much concerned about. So during the months of January, prices increased by 0.82%. Do we worry about inflation? To a point. As with everything else in economics, it depends. We actually consider inflation to be a normal occurrence in the economy, the same as a business cycle. It's just going to happen. And so we say that some inflation is really just fine. High inflation, yes, that's a concern. High inflation will erode purchasing power, and it's usually the job of the central bank to keep inflation under the control. So we are relying on our Federal Reserve, which is the central bank for the United States, to actually make sure that inflation is under control. We'll talk about the tools of Federal Reserve that can keep inflation under control. In general, if country's economic growth rate is faster than inflation rate, then inflation is not very harmful. What do we mean by that? If our GDP grows faster than inflation is happening, then we are okay. It's actually really, really normal for us to experience inflation. Inflation actually means that economy is growing. Because if inflation happens, it means we have higher demand for the goods and services that we did in the past. Higher demand is usually caused by us having enough money to purchase goods and services. So all it tells us that our economy is growing, which is good. When we experience the opposite, but there's absolutely no inflation, or prices decrease, even though a lot of people would love to see the prices going down, we say that's actually not a good sign. It means our economy is not growing and maybe we are heading towards the recession.